Welcome to Vision 360, where we look at cybersecurity from every angle, from the technical foundations to executive decision-making and leadership context. I am your host, Matthew Webster, and I work with cybersecurity executive leaders to align cybersecurity with business priorities, translating technical risk into language leaders can act on. My perspective comes from decades of experience in the field, including multiple CISO roles and years working directly with leadership teams, strengthening governance, leadership, and risk alignment at the executive level. So today, I'm honored to have Tom Hardin here, who is a former Wall Street trader whose involvement in insider training and later cooperation with the FBI has been well documented in his book, Wired on Wall Street. It's a fantastic read. I suggest that you read it. But what makes this story worth examining isn't just what happened, but how those decisions unfolded under pressure inside of high performance environments. Today, he speaks about ethics, judgment, and the realities of decision making when the stakes are high. So, Tom, if you could do a little bit better introduction of yourself and maybe like a quick overview of what your story looks like before we dive into some of the material, I think that would help our listeners.
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. So I'm Tom Hardin. About 15 years ago, I was also known as Tipper X, as the seminal informant in the largest FBI insider trading investigation of really a generation. And before I was an FBI informant, I was a middle-class kid from Georgia, left the South to attend an Ivy League college. I was a good student, started working on Wall Street in the early 2000s, and I became aware insider trading was rampantly happening in the hedge fund business where I worked. Doesn't excuse what we're going to talk about with my decisions, but it kind of sets the stage for the culture, which we'll talk about. I received 4 tips in 2007 over a 7-month period about deals happening in the market. Placed 4 small trades. I told myself I'm not hurting anybody, those classic rationalizations. My boss said, basically, this is amazing, but don't tell me you're doing it. So he's being willfully blind. And then 7 months after the 4th trade, the FBI's in my face on the street, asking me to help them build some bigger cases, which we'll talk about. So a lot was happening in the industry, but I always want to make the point that, a former wrongdoer, cheating is always a choice. So most people did not choose to cross the line. I did, and I paid consequences. And so that's where I am today. And the FBI invited me 10 years ago to speak about my experience. They arrested 81 people in these cases I was involved with, and I was the youngest person. And they told me I made the least amount of money. And I thought they were rubbing it in. I said I was actually trying not to get caught. And they said that's really the interesting part of this, the decision making, the pressures, the culture, the environment. And so for the last 10 years, I've been sharing my story in the book. Came out 2 months ago through Wiley Wired on Wall Street.
Thank you so much. So, and I think that background is very helpful that you gave, because when we start to get into the questions here, it's going to shape the context for what we're going to talk about. So thank you very much. So when you reflect back on that period, how would you describe the decision environment you're operating, particularly the pressure and the expectations to help to shape that judgment, especially towards that very first time?
Yeah, if I had to describe the environment in one line, I'd say it was a business where the time horizon kept compressing. The language around edge is what we called it, trading on inside information, kept getting looser. And nobody in my immediate orbit was trained or really incentivized to slow anything down. I was 28, a junior partner at a newly launched hedge fund. It was me, a senior partner, and our CFO. And our first year, we did well. We were up 20%, and that should have been a runway, building number. But we lost money in the first quarter. And after that, my boss closed the door and told me, I know we're investing over 3 years, but we have to find shorter term opportunities to make money every month, or we may not survive. And that single sentence for me reshaped everything. A 3-year horizon became a monthly horizon. And once the clock changes like that, the range of what feels possible changes with it. And I knew insider trading was happening. There were sort of the celebrated people in my business, the people with status, the people with 8-figure years and the car collections. And I wasn't, as a young man in my 20s, in those circles. It's sort of like evident it's happening. And when your whole peer set is telling you, through their lifestyle and their performance, that crossing the line means something more than working harder, and it means access and status, you start to kind of absorb that as a baseline.
So how did that baseline affect you? So that put pressure on you to maybe step over the line, but what were you, what were the signals? What were your emotions? How are you handling that?
Yeah, so I would see it happening, and there was this group I described in the book, sort of separated by ethnicity. So there was the Chinese mafia flying to Taiwan to get information from semiconductor companies they could trade on that was non-public. There was the Irish mafia guys from Boston trading on tips they were getting from Boston tech companies, and I'm seeing it in my career, and I'm not part of that group, but I'm also, I think, very as a young professional, just like insecure that I'm not part of that group, and they're the ones with status. And I never really felt I'd ever be in the situation we're going to talk about because I wasn't, in that group relationally. But once I got my first tip from a woman who worked for my billionaire Raj Rajaratnam, Tom, everybody's doing it. I'll give it to you. That became easy for me to step into those rationalizations and say, okay, these guys are making millions. I'll just cross the line one time. It's never more than it's never just one time, and I'll buy a small amount of stock because these guys are doing it much worse than me.
So that was definitely an influence because the whole world was doing it. It seemed like a minor step in your perspective.
Yeah, a relative step. I knew just to make a point. I knew I was crossing the line, so that wasn't really a gray area in my four trades. But I just sort of had put it in my head. Well, I'm just taking a flyer, doing something small compared to what these guys are doing, making millions.
Sure. So you made that first step, and then you decided at some point to take a second step. You're in for a penny, in for a pound is how some people like to refer to it as. What does that look like? How did you reconcile from an ethical standpoint, or did you? What did that process look like for you?
Yeah, you're right. And the honest answer, and I think it's an uncomfortable one, I knew exactly what I was hearing in this stock tip. So it was about a private equity company was going to buy a public company, in a few weeks. Here's the date, here's the price, here's the private equity firm. So I think anybody, if you don't work in finance, that sounds illegal. The awareness wasn't the problem of what I was doing. The problem was, what I did with the awareness. And for me, I reconciled it in real time. It was a combination of three things. It was language, comparison, and size. I never once said to myself, I'm committing insider trading. I said, I'm taking a flyer. And that phrase, taking a flyer, created just enough psychological distance between myself and the illicit act. It's the same mechanism you might see in an FCPA case where people call bribes, facilitation payments or tolls or tenders. They never call it a bribe. And the vocabulary reshapes how the brain categorizes the behavior. And the second part for me was comparison. I told myself these guys are going, way over the speed limit. What if I just go a little bit over? And third was the size. So I made sure that my stock position was less than 1% of the assets that we manage for clients. And that was actually the lax control where me as the junior person could put a stock in our portfolio as long as it was a small position. And so I engineered the decision to stay invisible, really, and then I used invisibility as I think about it as evidence that it wasn't really a big deal.
And some of that was just related to the speed or the pressure and the environment. All of those things play together to let you normalize that whole process.
Yeah, that's right. I think looking back when the goals went from make money over 3 years to losing money, and now we have to make money every month, that's a big red flag for any organization. And then
Sure.
the second part was after my boss came in with that mandate, I could now buy a stock in our portfolio as long as it was a small position. So then we had this control that was totally changed. And he didn't come in, if I could go back and, I talk to young people today or maybe junior people, like you have to ask clarifying questions when you get these ambiguous messages. Like the leader should try not to be ambiguous, but also, young Tom back in the day should have said, boss, it sounds to me like you're telling me anything goes. I know you don't mean that. And challenge him in a respectful way. I didn't do any of that. I just started making assumptions in isolation, and that's how it escalated.
Well, I think that's very key because you're talking about having curiosity, but the appropriate level of challenges. And that can feel, depending on the context and the situation, that can feel intimidating on its own. Like I know in some toxic environments, you're dealing with some very toxic leaders. They
Yeah.
mean a lot more than what they're saying. And was that an influence in what you're doing, or how would you characterize that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because you're right. It's easier for me 20, 15 years later or whatever to say, okay, young Tom, you should have challenged the boss, but you're right. we very much had a blame culture, which often precedes misconduct. So it's classic thing in my old business where any stock position doing well, we both want to take credit for it. And any position not doing well, it's the other person's problem. And so we were both guilty of that. And it was pretty toxic, just situations where we'd be yelling at each other. And I'm not a yeller, but it really brought that out of me in that environment. So when he walks in and makes the goals very short term, it would have been harder for me to challenge it because I know there's going to be potentially backlash or that type of thing. But I should have at least had the courage. And today we talk about psychological safety, and that's a big buzzword that wasn't around then, where you have to have the courage to actually challenge the senior manager, but as you said, in a respectful way, not you're telling me to break the law. Just hey, boss, the way I heard it was this way, and I think you meant it this way. Or could you
Right,
clarify
right.
that for me?
Yeah. And I think that's very important too, because there are lots of different personality types. And sometimes as people go up in culture, they start to behave in certain ways too. One of the topics that I tend to look at is something called the dark triad. But people become more narcissistic when they enter into those leadership positions. And a lot of people don't realize that or recognize that. And so a lot of things, what happens is the humility starts to go down. You start making more decisions based on what outcome you're looking for. Hey, how can I get the immediate results? And that's a common tension that can bring a culture of blame, but it could be related to a lot of different contexts. Was that part of the bigger picture for you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think even more so today, my sort of second act here of sharing the story and engaging with companies, I think you're right. People get promoted and they kind of judge themselves as they get hired by their intent, but the employee kind of judges them on what they heard or what the messaging was. And I think sometimes when we get to a higher level, we don't really realize our influence or that, what it could be doing because in our brains we have a certain intent that's not being communicated well. And also, I think it's really important for somebody at that level as they're hired to be able to listen very well. I would actually think about how a leader listens in terms of like something in terms of how they get compensated because it's really important thing in these situations where it's not clear. And if you're a really good listener, I think that's high character. We've been around people, a few times a year. I'll talk to somebody who's just a really good listener, and I just think that's a really interesting sign.
Yeah. And with listening too, I think a lot of that comes with curiosity, natural curiosity and
Yes.
asking questions. Like there's the five whys technique, which is a really
Hmm.
good technique. And that helps you to drive deeper and deeper and deeper because you're not always going to get the right answer
Right.
for somebody at a specific point in time. And that can definitely be a challenge, especially if they're short fused. I don't have time for this. You start pushing people off and that pressure comes in. A lot of those negative traits get amplified quite a bit, at least in my experience. Was that part of your experience as well?
Yeah, no, it was. It was. I was quite junior when this all happened, but the other people that was more senior, that was all behavioral traits, yes, of that position.
Sure. And so one of the things too, in the book you were talking about, having to get like, I can't remember the exact amount, but let's say it was like $10,000 cash in order to pay somebody for a tip. That must have
Okay.
sent off alarm bells in your head. He kind of described it in the book, but I'd love for you to dive into that a little bit more, talk about your feelings related to that. At that point, you're in the deep water at that point, from my perspective. But maybe I'm wrong.
No, you're right. I was in the deep water. So it really it escalated. So the way I just described was, March of that year where the tip comes in. I actually shared it with a friend before I traded just to kind of feel it out. And he buys it, and then I cross the line and buy a small amount of stock. And so that was March, April, May, June, July. 4 months later, the third tip is coming in, and now I've kind of normalized. Okay, placing trades. My boss not saying anything. It's fine. And then she says, okay, her source of information on this third tip has been selling this information. I think it was 8 hedge funds in New York are paying $15,000 for this information. And at first I thought, this sounds illegal. Like what I was doing, I rationalized small trades, but oh my God. But again, it starts with that one decision to cross the line and it escalates to me actually calling the guy I had tipped, getting that cash together, going through the airport. It's a pretty crazy story in the book where I'm walking through LaGuardia Airport, and back then it was just metal detectors, and so I had the cash like in my shirt and in my waistband and my socks. Got through the metal detector. I went to the restroom, put it back in my laptop bag in envelopes. I'm stopped at the gate of my flight before I board by TSA agents who were doing random searches. and they actually touched the envelopes and they said, "Hey, have a nice flight." So, but that was how it escalated. And I always say today, if you're doing something that either A, you wouldn't want your grandma to know about, or B, you wouldn't want it on the page of the Wall Street Journal test, that's always a good sign. So it's pretty shocking, I think, for people to see, all right, he rationalized it. Oh my God, he's got cash strapped to his body, but it's all incremental.
Yeah, I can imagine. And for me, that would freak me out carrying around cash like that. I'm carrying
It
more than a
freaked me out.
couple $100.
Yeah.
I'm getting worried, but
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. As I wrote the book and thought about it, I'm like, wow, what was I exactly thinking? That was quite a step to take. And I know for a domestic flight, I think they said, have a nice flight because it wasn't illegal domestically, but not something I advise.
yeah, absolutely. But at a certain point, as you talk about in the book, you got caught. You were tipper X, you were wearing an FBI wire. You know, how did that take place and how did that start to affect you emotionally? And was there like a rubber band effect for like, oh, maybe I really did step the line and a lot of reality started to step in? What did that look like psychologically for you as you're going through the process? Maybe describe the process for a couple minutes too.
Sure. So it was four trades I made, small positions. My boss not saying anything. They all happened. I think it was about 8 months after the fourth trade. So now we're July of 2008. If people remember, that was the financial crisis. I'm leaving my apartment to drop off some dry cleaning. Those four trades were last year, out of sight, out of mind. I'm just trying to survive in the market that year. And I step out of the dry cleaner, and this guy behind me says, "Are you Thomas Covey Hardin?" My full name on the Manhattan sidewalk. And growing up in Georgia, the last time I heard my full name was my mother, and it wasn't mom. I turned around, two FBI agents, dark suits, wallets out, come sit down with us. We sat down at a fast food restaurant. He's like, "Hey man, we know about your four trades. We know that you were just down in Georgia visiting your baby nephew for his baptism last weekend," and they knew his name. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, my parents are going to kill me. Oh my God, my wife's going to leave. We just got married. She had no idea about the four trades. And I thought, oh my gosh, this might impact my career. I might be going to prison. And so they laid it out for me. They were building these cases. They said I could help them out. They said, you can't talk to anybody other than your wife. I took his card. I didn't say, hey, let me talk to a lawyer. I never thought about that, like talking to a lawyer. I took his card and they told me, oh, we can give you guidance on when to talk to a lawyer. They're really not supposed to say that, but I'm scared and took his card. And that day, I actually violated what they said. I actually went to church and went for a confession to St. Patrick's Cathedral and talked to the priest. And he's like, your penance is to help the FBI. Now I should have talked to a lawyer, but I talked to a priest, told my wife, and she took it as well as she could. As I researched the book, 85% of marriages in this situation, and ours didn't. So it's really kudos to her. And I met with the FBI, and it was an interesting situation as an informant because I had to bring them who I thought were the worst actors. So usually, if you're wearing a wire, you would have to say, "Oh my gosh, am I going to wear a wire on the guy I tipped, who was probably a friend or even a relative or something?" And that wasn't my position I was in, and so I had to build kind of lists of names of who I felt were the worst actors, and then find a way to get meetings with these people. And my cover for the meeting was, hey, I'm a young analyst. It's 2008. I'm probably going to lose my job, which is a good cover to get the meeting. And then, by the way, how do you insider trade? So it was really kind of sloppy in the beginning. And then the FBI sort of told me to ask the question and say nothing. So the silence technique with negotiation or sales, just make your offer, say nothing. And eventually these guys started talking. So I detail a lot of these crazy stories in the book and kind of a framework I came up with later in terms of how I actually did this.
Yeah, I can imagine, but I also can feel imagine, and I don't know, you'd have a lot of guilt related. These are people in some sense they're helping you, but in some certain sense they've created an environment where they're betraying you at the same time. At least this is what it looks like from an outside perspective. And how did that affect you? Because that must have been a bit of a hit.
It is, and I'm of two minds because occasionally over the years, oh, Tom's a rat. Like the way I thought about it was, and I mentioned this in the book, they're going after everybody they can catch. It's a wide net, and they kept mentioning two friends who I was close to. Yes, I did tip on one of the trades, and I thought, okay, the way I thought about this is I'm going to protect these guys who I think are good guys by bringing them who I think are the bad guys. And so it was a real dilemma, as you said, because was it even ethical to become an informant? And I think for me, the way I thought about this was, all right, now I'm going to start making good decisions and help these guys. But again, to be clear, I'm not a whistleblower, right? Sometimes I get introduced as Tom Hardin whistleblower. I'm not doing this on my own volition, right? I'm only
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
this because I'm caught. And this prosecutor told me just the suicide rate for informants is 100 times the general population. It's not a surprise.
Yeah.
Tragically, three people I shared in the book killed themselves, and it wasn't, thank God, that dark for me. Of all things, my wife staying with me, helped my mental health. But you're really of two minds. Like, I'm trying to get these guys, kind of entrap these guys to talk about crimes they committed, and it borders on that. And who knows, maybe these were other also good people. I just didn't know them that well. I thought they were the worst actors, but I think most people, were going home to their families and family people. And so it was just a weird situation. But I also told myself to kind of keep myself sane that maybe this is going nowhere. Like I shared, I would do these conversations. There was really no feedback on if this was a good conversation or not until almost 2 years into this, 20 guys were arrested. And the only name that wasn't released was called Tipper X. And of course, I called the FBI my Tipper X. They said, "Yep, that's you."
Yeah, I'm sure that was amazing. I mean, kind of switching gears just a little bit here, because we've gone through a lot of stuff from a personal side. Now switching
Mhm,
into a corporate side. From an
mhm.
executive standpoint, where do you think leaders typically misunderstand this dynamic and what can we learn from that? Because obviously things can go wrong. You felt the raw end of that deal from that perspective. How do you think these decisions start to affect things from your viewpoint, both at the leadership level and at people underneath them?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception I see today when a company engages me for a talk or a board, and I see this by the way, companies with world-class compliance functions, is the belief that misconduct is mostly a bad apples problem. There's a mental model, that somewhere in the organization, there's a rogue operator, and if we can just identify them faster, the organization is safe. And that framing, I think, for people feels intuitive. It's also wrong in ways that leave enormous risk on the table because it focuses the searchlight on the apples and almost never on the barrel. And what leaders get wrong, I think specifically, is three things. First, they assume like rational deterrence works. The model is show people the rules, show them the consequences, and rational actors will stay in line. And I can tell you, I never once looked up sentencing guidelines before I placed a trade. I never thought about ever being caught because I was trading small. And I could probably assure you, too, the people I helped build cases against didn't do that either. So misconduct, it doesn't happen at the end of a cost benefit analysis, right? It happens inside of a fog of pressure we discussed, that compressed time horizon, rationalization, isolation, and where the sort of quote cost side of the analysis never fully loads. Deterrence is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And leaders confuse compliance with culture. They think just because they have policies, the training, the attestations, and the hotline, that they're covered. But culture isn't what's written on the wall. Culture is the set of behaviors your employees believe will actually be rewarded. If your code says, raise concerns early, as we were discussing, and the person who last raised concerns got quietly reassigned, every employee in the building now knows that the real rule is, quote, don't raise concerns. And you don't have a compliance problem, you have, a lying problem. And your people figure out the rules fast always, and they act on the real rules and not the laminated ones. And just to close this thought out, I push so I specifically push on any sort of CISO or compliance executive, like leaders dramatically underestimate the power of their own silence. They think neutrality is a safe posture, and it isn't. So when the manager brings you something borderline and you say, use your judgment, you're not really empowering them. You're very likely signaling that you don't want to know. And when a leader says, I trust my team as a way of not engaging with the hard question, the team hears, don't bring me this again. And so the most dangerous messages in an organization aren't the ones that get sent. They're the ones that get implied. And so silence is never neutral. It's always interpreted. And in my experience, it gets interpreted as permission.
Yeah, I like that phrasing too, because when you talk about leadership, it can be definitely a very challenging thing because there are some, like if you need to give constructive criticism, for example, usually it's good to be honest about it, but one of the things we're always constantly looking for threats. And the rule that I've seen is for every negative interaction, you need five positive interactions. And so there's always like a tension. How far do you go on pressing things forward, especially you add the toxicity to that, that adds a whole nother layer that people have to be very careful of. And so people's behavior starts to revolve around that culture, in my experience. Um, and then also, before we started talking, you were mentioning a little bit about, a study that was something like 3% of the people are going to be good people and do the right thing all the time, 3% are bad, and then 94% are going to go along with whoever's around them. So, talk to me a little bit about that dynamic from your perspective and getting that whole picture in place. I think that would be really, really interesting for leaders to hear.
Yeah, I can, if anybody wants to reach out, listens later, I'm happy to send it to you. There's a behavioral science researcher a few years ago that was looking at misconduct and bucketed it into, 3% are always who you have to worry about. They're always testing the lines, HR compliance, more tended to be potential nefarious actors. Then the other side is 3% are your Girl Scouts, your Boy Scouts, and then the 94% in the middle. And so many times, the training that we do is really just focused on that 3%. And I think we often neglect the 94%, where the 94% comes into the room and like, okay, this isn't for me. This is just like for somebody who's going to be a bad actor. So maybe your 3% are nefarious, but your 94% could be negligent, right? So maybe you're not doing something like I did with the intent I was doing, but you could also, be in a situation we all could be in where you start rationalizing. There's silence, there's incremental pressure, all those things happen. So I would encourage people who maybe on the training function, if that's in your sort of what you do in your role, like to think about, okay, how is this message being received by the 94% in the middle? And I'm actually, usually called in by compliance during the annual training to share my story. And it's so often where it's well intended, but it's usually I sit before and I will hear the training before I speak. And it's usually like compliance education, like, ladies and gentlemen, here's the latest rules and regs. And it's not really calibrated to the role of the person. And so there's a difference between education and training. Like, training is, here's the new rule, but here's how it applies to your role. Here's all you need to know. Like, to have annual training for thousands of people at once, it doesn't really work because it's not calibrated to the role. So I always encourage the compliance people to go a little bit deeper and think about, am I just providing education or am I providing training? And so I think that's something just for people to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's a real key point. I mean, a lot of the more advanced compliance models that are out there, they do require tailored training. Okay, here's maybe for the executives. Maybe you're gonna have three or four different bands. Here's something for the IT and cybersecurity teams, and here's for the general populace. But there's always a lot more than that when you're looking at things. Have you, with companies that do that, have you found a lot of changes in the behavior once it's tailored? And I think tailoring probably is not enough either, but it is a step in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure, because then you actually get it in the words of the business. So sometimes it's like the compliance will bring in a business leader just to sort of help them translate the message. And the bigger thing is that the compliance people are often, thought of as a support function or in the way of the business. And I always tell them, hey, you're a partner to the success of the business, right? And so the chief compliance officer, the CISO, you're all C-suite executives, right? And so if the compliance officer doesn't have the status of a C-suite executive, then it's really not it's not going to work as well. And so I guess the important thing is to have status, to have that respect that you're not just support. And I always tease them, like, I think the term officer is like not a great term because it sounds like police officer. Like, you're more like the protector of people's careers. And I learned that the hard way. And so I think once you have the status and you're doing the training and it's calibrated, then you're on the right path and you're not just a voice in the back of the room who's always perceived to be in the way of the commercial
Yeah, yeah.
runway of the business.
And you're one of the issues is kind of coming up as we go through and talk about it, because on a certain level, when you went through your whole process, you had a certain alignment. You're kind of pushing things off. You mentioned the psychological distance you have from the actions you're doing, and of course that grew over time. But I don't think most people sit around and say, "I'm an evil person. I want to do something
Yeah.
bad." That's just not how most people look at. There's a set of justifications, and you brought up a really interesting point too: survival. You were in a place where you're really looking at how do I survive in my role, and especially under a lot of pressure. And a lot of companies don't even realize the level of pressure that they're adding. How do you think those dynamics start to play into that decision-making process, and what would you advise leaders based on that context?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Once my goals became compressed, then the whole the whole way I was thinking about this was, okay, now I have to make money, every month. And once that happens, again, I didn't say, okay, now I'm going to go look for some insider trading opportunities, but that certainly definitely set the stage. And to your point, I wasn't going to the office twirling my mustache. How do I break federal securities laws? That's not how it works. But also, um, the biggest part of the fraud triangle for me was, there's the need. So we had need for short-term performance. There was the opportunity now because now I could buy a stock that was less than 1% of our assets, and the rationalization. So for anybody, yeah, you're not going to walk into the office, hopefully, trying to break the law, but you can rationalize. And so for me, the big ones were, everybody's doing it, or it felt like that at the time. What I'm doing is immaterial. I'll just do it one time. And I can still think of myself as a good guy. And there's this term in psychology called fudge factor, where we all want to think of ourselves as good people. Sometimes we want to cheat up to the point we can do that, but rarely does it escalate to this. But that was my line of thinking at the time.
Sure.
So I always encourage people in these situations. Another big takeaway is just like don't make decisions in isolation. Everybody I think listening or has teams. You're there to support each other, to have pre-mortems. Okay, before we make this decision, let's talk about where it could go wrong. And for me, as I look back as a young professional, I'm making these decisions in my head. I'm not talking to anybody, not even talking to my boss, not talking to my wife, not talking to anybody. So I think where could decisions in an organization or a team uh, be being made in isolation, and what can we do? How do we have an intervention before things escalate? And rationalizations don't survive when you start voicing them. So sort of, I guess, shining the sunlight on the rationalization when it can't survive being spoken into a group. Usually, then it's called out.
Yeah. So, like, I'm going to use some of my language here, but it sounds like you're looking at scenario analysis because that pre-mortem to me is absolutely what risk management is all about. You're just taking it down to a human level because you're bringing things out. You're talking about, hey, here's this kind of semi-conscious rationalizations, and then you're talking about breaking that through having good conversations and opening up and asking questions.
Yeah, and for me, if anything, when I come in and share my story, I just want people to highlight for themselves in their head, okay, try to catch yourself rationalizing, okay, or if I feel like I have to make this decision and I can't talk to anybody, then that's a red flag. All right, let me escalate this. And so stop before the wheels are turning, and also have that pre-mortem, and discussing earlier the psychological safety to actually escalate concerns or questions, or speak up. And so that's a good place where we can mitigate the risk of somebody stepping across the line who might be in that middle 94%.
Sure. For the organizational development person in me, when you look at some of the companies, and a lot of companies don't have this. Part of what they have is they have like an anti-bullying policy or practice where they go investigate if bullying was actually taking place. Have you found those to be effective at trying to stop some of the quote unquote bad apples? So hopefully the problems will not escalate out and spread out as much as they possibly would. And what does that actually look like from your perspective in terms of the effectiveness?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge because just because you have a rule like anti-bullying doesn't mean, so in certain companies, you're right, it can not mean a whole lot. So, just I would keep that in mind just because there's a rule on the page. What behavior is it going to actually drive? And as far as like policies and when they come in, I'm often brought in during speak up programs, and speak up is a big thing in organizations, but
Sure.
rarely do we tell the listeners, and we talked about this earlier, to actually listen up. So if you're going to tell the people to speak up, you have to listen up. And so many times, I guess it's kind of sad where offline, the middle manager is just views speaking up as career risk. This idea, again, another bad term is the term whistleblower. It just sounds like, let's change it to like person of conscience or something, right? Like whistleblower just is like the worst
Yeah.
term to use for that, for what the person is doing, is actually, acting with integrity, acting like with a personal moral compass, like wanting to do the right thing. And so many times it's just people now share me their own stories of just, hey, again, I'm under pressure. I have a family. I'm not gonna raise concerns here or speak up because they won't listen up. And once my boss knows I'm raising a concern, it's going to be, I'll be kind of sidelined off the next project. And unfortunately, even companies that have great policies on paper, this is still something that pretty much, every industry still deals with.
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge because you look at the American corporation, we are built on we need more money faster. That's a lot of times what the executives are looking at and what the CFO cares about. And it's not quite true, but in the board, you find that too. So that ends up being a big challenge because we're automatically putting the pressure in place on corporations and on everybody because the pressure's there almost from day one. You don't just start out like, hey, we've got enough money, we're going to keep things open. There's always pressure. Even if it's just, hey, I need to get a bigger bonus this year, what can I do to get away with stuff like that? That ends up being a big challenge. And so what also happens too when you're underneath these pressures, what I like to look at systems one thinking is that fast. We need to make a decision. We're there. And your rationality, depending on the context, can go down by as much as 94%. It's pretty severe how much it goes away. When you look at a more rational approach, that's where you get to, I like to look at, is systems two thinking. This is
Mhm.
where you're being more thoughtful about the approach. Those can all be big influences from your standpoint. For the organizations that you've worked with that have been more focused on, let's create a more rational approach to things, how have you seen that affect corporations, or where have I also mischaracterized some of my interpretation?
No, I think it's a great point. And I got to meet I think it was right as I started speaking, I got to shake Daniel Kahneman's hand. So it was at a conference. So that's system one, system two. He's sort of the godfather of behavioral science. And I would say yes, controls matter, but you also want people to rehearse. Okay, like you said, the pressure is going to come. What will I do in the moment? How will I escalate things? What might that look like? Sort of on that pre-mortemish side. And so you don't want somebody just going and making, decisions on their intuition. I mean, we might have good intuition, but you want to actually have that sort of rehearsed. And so I'm big about muscle memory in these situations. Just think about what's the equivalent situation of Tom's boss coming in and saying, well, now we have to make money every month for this group. And then once you've rehearsed that and have muscle memory, it's easier to execute like any sport. So
Sure.
that's a big thing. I would say clearly just because I don't want anyone to hear me minimize them, but on controls, but you also, you need those walls and the locks. But from what I've seen, both inside my own story and in the hundreds of organizations I've worked with, is that formal controls are necessary and profoundly insufficient. And what actually moves behavior under pressure, I think, is a combination of proximity, modeling we talked about, and the lived experience of what happens when somebody raises a hand. And just on proximity, does someone have to justify the decision to another human being before acting? And so not in writing, in that conversation. And I've actually come to believe that the term it's called eustress, 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 the productive friction of having to explain yourself before making that decision is one of the most underrated things I've seen in companies. Not many do it, but the most underrated protective mechanisms in an organization. And it's not, it's not bureaucracy, it's a guardrail. And the dangerous decisions in my life happened in the sort of 10 minutes alone at my desk. And every single one of them would have failed if I'd had to walk down the hall and explain myself to one person.
Sure, absolutely. So if you were working with, let's start with the CEO or the board, and had some
Mm.
concerns and stuff like that is going on in organizations, and it does. I mean, the iceberg of ignorance to me is very real, and you're describing some of the mechanisms too, the guardrails, but also some of the problems and how they start to arrive. What would you be paying attention to prior before something becoming a legal issue or even another type of material issue within an organization?
Yeah, the tell I'd put at the top of the list, and this is what I do, it's a little bit different, is language, and specifically the presence of a shared internal vocabulary that makes questionable behavior sound ordinary. And so once you hear the euphemism become the native tongue, we're smoothing the numbers, we're cleaning up the trial data, we're taking a flyer in my case, we're helping the client tell their story. You're not looking at a rhetorical issue, you're looking at an architecture. So people don't invent those phrases to deceive others. They invent them to quiet their own discomfort, which means the discomfort is already there. And I was working with a company last year, a pharmaceutical company, where the general counsel said, that they had actually built a vocabulary for making fraud sound like diligence, and nobody noticed. And so he was brought in and replaced the other person. So listen for that. It's the most diagnostic thing in the whole stack. And another signal is where discretion sits in the organization. So board level or anybody in the
If we
company,
could
can
jump
somebody in your
back a little bit, because I think that
Mhm.
story, I'd love to hear more about that lawyer story, because I think there's a lot more you could unpack there that I find really fascinating.
Yeah, no, he just shared that this was what they were talking about. I think it was around there was an anti-bribery FCPA case, maybe 8 years ago at the company, and they were sort of building a vocabulary where they're taking out the reps, and they're calling it. I think it was I forget the actual term, but it was about a year ago. But they were calling it something else,
Sure.
and I guess it just wasn't flagged by their compliance people as to what was actually happening, and it escalated to an FCPA investigation. There was a fine. I don't think there was a prison sentence, but it was a reputational hit for the company. And
Right.
so, general counsel, a well-educated person, is not just on top of the actual language people are using. And a lot of companies aren't, because I'll ask them like, "Hey, when I share my story, I'm going to talk about taking a flyer. Like, what do your people say?" And they're like, "Well, I'm not sure." Well, you have to understand the language of the business. And so maybe in the legal and compliance, it just wasn't that in tune. So you'd want to, in that role, to actually understand how do people describe deals, what's the competition doing. So many times a company will bring somebody in from a competitor and they'll say, this is the way we used to describe things in our old company. Okay, I want to understand that and ask more questions around that, even in
Yeah.
onboarding. So that's something that's not really talked about in leadership discussion, but something I see sort of like mapping my story onto the specific kind of training I do today.
Yeah, and I think that's powerful. So let's go back to, I know I interrupted you a little bit because I think you
Oh,
just
sure.
hit on
Yeah.
a just a brilliant story that deserved a little more attention. So what are some other things that you do to recommend that CEOs or boards really focus on? So you've mentioned some, but
Yeah.
you're on a roll there. So if you could continue that
Yeah, no,
role.
thank you. Just I'm actually rolling out this training for a client in a few weeks, so I'm just been working on this. But the sort of the second signal is I'd say where discretion sits in the organization. So can somebody in your company cross a major ethical line without ever having to justify it to another human being first? And if they can, it's not a behavioral problem yet, but it's more of a structural one. And I had that at my firm. I could buy these stocks under 1%. And private equity firms have it around deal sourcing and speed, and banks have it under individual trader discretion, and pharma has it around sort of clinical data decisions. Tech firms have it around releases that ship before security testing completes. And so you want to find those gaps, and ask, is friction there to protect us, or have we stripped it out in the name for speed? And we talked about that before. And kind of one hard truth, I think, one other idea is that, and the one people don't really talk about enough, is sort of pay attention to what happens to the last person who raised a sort of issue that wasn't convenient for the commercial success of the business. And I always ask every leadership team this question, and I'll tell you the answer tells me more about the culture than any engagement survey ever will. If the honest answer is this person who raised a hard truth, let's call them, got sidelined, or they got labeled a problem, or their career stalled, your people have received that message loud and clear, and your reporting numbers are not going to save you. And conversely, if you can point to someone who flagged something uncomfortable and got visibly, publicly supported for it, you've probably got a culture that's worth defending.
Yeah, that's powerful. Have you found a tipping point, say, where the culture's gone too far, it's gotten too rotten to bother with, or is there a tipping point, or what would that look like for you in terms of cultural restoration?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a good question. It can get too rotten to come back from without a total change in management if the misconduct happens, and it's really just being focused every time, like the internal audit's doing the root cause analysis and they're only focusing on getting rid of the apples, doing more training, and sort of telling the business, maybe in silence or what's not being said, that just try not to get caught again. And I think that if it's the same people and the same board, it's very hard to come back from. But if you're willing to go in, do a true RCA, look at the structure, the barrel, not just the apple, and ask hard questions. Actually, ask questions that you may not want to know the answers to. That's also good for people to think about, because that might reflect back on some accountability problem with leadership. And that's, if you have, again, the safety to be able to do that and really want to understand the root cause of why something happened, then I think you can sort of step back from the brink if it was a reputational hit, and actually take true steps to improve. before the next situation. So more about the barrel and less about just the apple. And management has to be comfortable that it might reflect on them, but they also have to be accountable for their own part in what happened, and not sort of deflect on that.
Sure. And the one other thing I think is sort of interesting here too, because you take that 3%, 94, 3% level, 3% of the bad apples. But what's sort of interesting, going back, I briefly mentioned something called the dark triad. Um, they tend to want the positions of power. They typically are those bad apples that people are so concerned about in this overall process. What does that look like from your perspective? Because usually that's where the problem people are. You get that strong narcissistic personality who's trying to protect their image. You get into, hey, let's deal with the roles over reality and the perception over reality and the optics. That creates a major cultural change pretty drastically that people read. And oftentimes, and in that whole world of psychology, you have something called the flying monkeys. These are the people that go along with exactly what they're saying. They're doing the abusive work. They're antagonizing problems. They're creating further issues. A lot of people are willing to just do that yes sir, no sir thing, and it's inappropriate and it just snowballs the problem pretty drastically. So those are some challenges too. How do you address something like that in your experience?
Like, they have to be called out, they have to be dealt with. This is the actual toxic problem, sort of more of the toxic leadership that happens, and they really have to be addressed. Even, if it's the top person, the top salesperson, that even though they might be successful in hitting their KPIs, and doing and commercially successful for the business, it's still going to be just a toxic situation for that company, because people, as you said, see, okay, this is how we get ahead. We manipulate, we are narcissists, that type of thing. And so often the situation there is, when if it's not addressed, you get sort of this culture of, okay, this is what it takes to get done. And we're back to actually talking about, these are the behaviors that we don't want, and those behaviors are being rewarded because this person's working their way up. So you really do have to address it, and take steps to mitigate that, whether it's dismissal of the person. But easier for me to say than do. I can sort of go in and advise companies,
Right.
but it's sometimes harder, as you mentioned, because it's that person that can really game the system well politically and
Oh
narcissistically, and just
yeah.
sort of get to that rung. Sort of the Pareto principle, we're promoted to like the
Yep.
level of our least competence. It's a big problem too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I had that game with the Peter principle when I was a little
Peter
kid, so
principle.
I
Yeah,
got
yeah, yeah, yeah,
exposed to it
exactly.
very. I didn't
Right.
understand it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, no, I totally get what you're describing there. So, from a closing perspective, now we'll just kind of end up. I know we've just got a few minutes left. Having seen this from both inside and outside and back, has how has your view of accountability evolved between the individual and the institution, especially over the last few years? Because you're talking about some stuff that is fantastic that are not in your book today.
Yeah. It's evolved a lot, and I appreciate the question. I'm writing a lot more about this today. I'm asked by companies to come in and do accountability training, and the evolution, I think for me, my understanding was uncomfortable because it required me to stop, using a word. Years ago, I wrote about this in the book. I told myself I made mistakes, and that helped me feel better about the bad decisions I make. And so, the minute I started calling them bad decisions, my own personal relationship with accountability changed. And so, yes, I was held accountable by law enforcement, which I should have, but like, I kept telling myself other guys were doing it worse. And once I actually accepted responsibility, that changed for me. And so that's the internal piece. And I think it's the piece most institutions and most individuals never actually do. The punishment is external, but the real accountability is internal. And the legal consequences didn't change me, but refusing to call my crimes mistakes is what changed me. And so, where I think it's evolved institutionally is, I used to think that if a company had the right policies, trained its people well, enforced consequences, that the institution had done its job. And I no longer think that. I think most organizations confuse accountability with blame, and they pay a real price for it. Almost every time a CEO or a CHRO tells me, Tom, we need more accountability here, what they actually mean, unfortunately, is like, we need a cleaner way to assign consequences. And those are not the same thing. So blame is about locating the failure in a person. Accountability is about locating the conditions that produce the failure. And organizations that stop at blame keep repeating the same incidents with different names on them, because they've punished the apple and never examined the barrel. And the last thing I'd say on this is that individual and institutional accountability aren't two separate topics. They kind of feed on each other. And I could not have done my own internal accountability work without the legal system forcing the issue. And I own that. But I also couldn't have done it without a specific institutional response. A judge who read my cooperation letters, an FBI agent who saw me more than the worst thing I'd ever done. And that sort of moment mattered. And so it was the institution saying, we think your experience has utility. And if I'd written it off and been exiled forever, I don't know that I'd ever done any of this work. So the way I hold it now is that accountability requires both the individual refusing to hide and the institution refusing to pretend it was all one person's problem, and neither one
Yeah.
alone is enough.
And that's really tough, especially when you're dealing with the very manipulative people, the Machiavellians,
Yeah.
as part of the aspect of
Yes.
the dark triad. They
Yeah.
are very good at forming the narrative that fits whatever role is going to protect them. And that's always a big challenge. Any last minute thoughts on that?
Yeah, and again, going back to accountability being blamed. Yeah. So who are we here to blame on this? Like, why are people wanting to be held accountable? Or why aren't they seeking accountability? Because you're telling them if they raise their hand, they're going to be blamed. Right. So
Yeah.
it's more about ownership of the decision. We want ownership of the outcome. I was speaking to a leader at a company where she said she just calls people in when they screw up and they're nervous. Oh my God. Okay, what went wrong? How are you going to fix it? Okay. And how are you going to be sure it doesn't happen next time? Okay, go do that. And so people are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to bat for this leader. She's amazing. Like that's what we want, not the Machiavellian type.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you very much for being here today. I personally got a lot out of it. I think the listeners are also going to get a lot out of this. But for those that are listening, I definitely pick up the book Wired on Wall Street. I got so much out of the book. I found it fascinating, and it was a very slow tale that was intense towards the end. It is just worth your read, even if you've never thought about this stuff before. So I want to thank you, Tom. Any last minute thoughts from your perspective?
No, feel free to reach out to me. Tipper X. I've now actually got the U.S. Patent Office gave me the trademark for Tipper X. I'm the only Tipper X out there. So the next cases will have to be Tipper Y. But I think the practical sort of thing I'd like to leave with leaders, and if we're ever in a situation, I actually use it with my own teenage daughters today, so it's not just in the boardroom, is like one single question: would you want tomorrow, would you tomorrow want you today to do what you're thinking about to do? And that's with the version sitting of you sitting at the kitchen table 24 hours, 24 days, 24 months from now, what would they want you to choose right now? And the gratification from a short cuss lasts minutes, but the story you'll live with lasts forever. And so mine sure has. So again, there's the cautionary tale on that. And so just I hope that stays with people.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you, Matthew.
Bye bye, everybody.